Good morning. A lot of things to put together. I want to take you just on a small journey to another aspect, but it complements everything you've heard this morning. Another aspect of how our science is going wrong and can be put right. Just think back. Knowledge is power. When I talk, I'm going to do it more or less ad lib and show a few slides by way of summary at the end. So you won't see anything up here until I've finished the main argument. Knowledge is power, famously said Francis Bacon, and indeed all the early founders of the Royal Society followed that idea that science, as Geoffrey Bolton introduced us to, is for the benefit of humanity, and the mission of the Royal Society of London said that, in the words of Robert Boyle of 1660 or so, and added, for the benefit of humanity and of nature. And the question is, can we keep up to the second one of those? Science is the making of knowledge. It's bound to be powerful. If knowledge is power, and science the making of knowledge, Wissenschaft in German is a much better word than science in that sense. Whether it inevitably leads to power, or whether it's a motivation of power that leads to science, is the open question. Do we go to science in order to have power? It certainly didn't originally. It was curiosity that drove science and produced power. And I think that's what Bacon probably meant. I don't know. But we now use science to get power. Science is there for the economy of the country. That's power. It's a distortion right at the beginning. I want to look at an aspect of that. If we look at agriculture as the example of a technology that creates power by being a technology, that is age-old, 10 or 12,000 years, and it's steadily improved. But it took a huge step forward in the beginning of the 19th century with the discovery of Liebig, the birth of chemistry, which was going on, the discovery of Liebig, which showed that plants for agriculture will grow on 3 salts containing nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. And that founded Rothamsted Experimental Station. The 2 people who founded it collaborated with Liebig. One of them went to Germany to study with Liebig for a year and founded Rothamsted Experimental Station. And thereby did a scientific innovation at the time, namely that plants live from NPK. But notice, and this is where we need to follow it up, that was done in complete ignorance, necessarily, of what we would now think we need to know before we can apply a new revolutionary technology like that to agriculture. They knew nothing of plant physiology, nothing of bacteria, no biochemistry. Almost everything we would now want as part of the science of agriculture, it's beginning to be so, was missing in 1843 when Rothamsted started its huge experiment to feed fields of wheat with N, P, and K forever. And that experiment is ongoing, but it created the whole agrochemical industry on the basis of ignorance. That's a very blunt and dangerous statement, I know, but that is the situation as far as I can see it. So over the years, the missing biology from that initial bit of innovation was filled in. Liebig himself realized that it wasn't the complete story. He, in fact, had long arguments with the founders of Rothamsted as a result, especially over nitrogen. I'm very aware of that, and there isn't time to go into all that now, and I don't know that I can, but there were arguments. Liebig sensed that there was something more to it, and that somehow atmospheric nitrogen would get into the plant. He was right. The fixation of nitrogen by plants was discovered 40 years later in the 1880s. Sorry, get the centuries right. I'm old enough to do that. The 1880s discovered nitrogen fixation. They also discovered mycorrhiza, and Pasteur by then had put bacteria into the knowledge of our world. Things were moving fast. But the industry of agriculture based on NPK was thriving commercially as well as intellectually. Rothamsted continued its experiments on those original wheat fields and celebrated being able to follow growing wheat on the same plots with NPK for 150 years, when they celebrated that success in 1993 with a big symposium, a meeting, I guess, a bit like this one, with people around the world describing what had been achieved in agriculture. It was terrific, but the volume was published, and the publication, I wasn't at the meeting in 1993, the publication does not mention soil humus, does not mention mycorrhiza. It has the basis of what had been discovered in the meantime actually missing. I had occasion at the Oxford Real Farming Conference to question a senior researcher in Rothamsted, when did Rothamsted start researching mycorrhiza? And he answered, oh, we've been doing it since at least the 80s, 1980s, not 1880s. They were 100 years late in starting a bit of very valuable research into agriculture with mycorrhiza. 90% of plants depend on mycorrhiza for their uptake of nutrients, and the NPK fertilizers suppress the mycorrhiza. That we know now. We know now, therefore, there was a big mistake made, necessarily made, in those early stages. So how on earth do we go on? During that time, early 20th century, Albert Howard was the crucial one to put the story together. In the Agricultural Testament that he wrote in 1940, he had been in India, realized that mycorrhiza are crucial. We now know much more than that. A whole soil microflora is emerging just now in the last years as being absolutely necessary to maintain the fertility and health of the soil. So that is gradually developing in that direction. But in that process, the now traditional NPK attitude in agriculture remains. There are two results from this split. Notice that to understand these, the initial experiment was one of intervention. The fertilizers added to plants, they work. The plants grow bigger and greener, and yields are up. And Malthus was contradicted temporarily, that instead of expanding food by growing it on more land, you can expand it by growing more food on less land. It was a fantastic achievement, but built on that massive bit of ignorance. And as a result of that intervention, sorry, I just go back a little bit. That was an intervention. The understanding of the biology of the science was an observation. They are different from an intervention. in biology, you have two processes in a way. You do an experiment, which is necessarily an intervention, and observe the result. Add NPK, you get bigger plants. But you also can do an observation where the biologist has to design their process not to interfere with what is going on biologically. So an intervention is out of place. An observation is in place. You can observe mycorrhiza. You can observe bacteria. You can then do experiments, but you know they are experiments and interventions. There's a big difference between an intervention and an observation. So with that as background, where are we now? There are two main results of that approach. One is that there are two communities of scientists. In this case, the agro-chemists looking at the original NPK fertilization. That is still going on. They've developed a tremendous arrogance of all the things they're doing. They've realized that you mustn't have too much nitrogen, so you make slow-release fertilizers, all sorts of techno-fixes. But on the other side, there's a whole lot of scientists. Initially, Albert Howard was one of the initiators of the whole organic movement, which is actually the observational science of how plants grow. It should be the basis of the science of agriculture, but it is the fringe minority. There were 2 or 3 adverts I picked up in France in 1981 at an agricultural exhibition. And this is the mentality of the agro-industry, which doesn't mind the intervention. A herbicide, the confidence of the conqueror, that is the mentality. But look at also what is being conquered, the beautiful flowers. The French are very romantic people. It's great. There was another one like that, not shown here, of a field completely cleared, acre upon acre, by another herbicide, right to the distant church village in the photo, well, in the drawing. So there was the arrogance of Bayer in this case. Now it's Monsanto, Bayer also. The arrogance that we can do it, here it works. And the herbicides work. So you'd think that nowadays you can't, okay, yes, I'm in time. Nowadays you can't work, you wouldn't publish a thing like that anymore. You're wrong. There it is, the new GM herbicide-resistant crops can take the new herbicides, and again, right to the distance as far as you can see, total conquest, we have succeeded. And that is cartooned in this. The attitude, it's really perfect. It kills every bloody thing in 200 miles without changing the ecological balance. Well, I ask you. Waddington had lots of Greek words for how biology works. The creod, homoresis, homoretic progress instead of homostatic progress. It was the movement of biology. But he also invented an Anglo-Saxon word, the conventional wisdom of the dominant group. It just underlines what I've been saying. So the answer has to come from what remains the fringe science. This is the trouble we are in. The fringe science was, for instance, a follow-up to Albert Howard, Chabousseau in France, translated then to English. Chabousseau was 1985. The translation was 2004, totally neglected. In a few corners of Europe, Chabousseau is the Bible, but in most of agricultural science, he's not known. I'm engaged at the minute with one or two colleagues trying to make that into a publicity. There are solutions, many, many solutions, but they are on the fringe. We don't look at them. They're perfectly good science. Miraculous abundance, a tiny little area in Normandy, which has been carefully monitored for inputs and outputs on purely agro-ecological scientific principles, a remarkable bit on lousy soil of sustainable, productive agriculture. It's all available, but we don't do it. So this is a plea for getting on and doing it. So that's one publication. There are hundreds, but that is all I have to say. The options are there before us, and why is the fringe still the fringe? Let's hope it'll be like the Edinburgh Festival, where the fringe has become the main festival. Thank you.